This is part 1 of Unit 12. This is part 1 of Unit 12, and as you probably know, this unit is covering the Great Depression, or pretty much the 1930s in American history. And just in case you don't know, the Great Depression is the worst economic period in our country's history. That's what its definition is. Sometimes this era is called the Dirty 30s. We'll learn more about that. That's because of something called the Dust Bowl that occurs during the 1930s. But basically, this is a time when America's going through a real hard economic period where people are out of work, businesses are closing down, people are having a hard time providing for their family, these kinds of things. And we'll get into a lot of that in more detail, and you're already doing a lot of that with your seminar work, hopefully. But there are two main questions that we are, as historians, going to try to discover here, or focus our attention on as we go through this unit. The first one is, as usual, how did this happen, or why did this happen? How did we get in this situation? How did we get into the worst economic period in our country's history? What things brought that along? Now, we probably have some ideas about that from what we learned in the Roaring 20s or the 1920s, but there are a few things also that kind of all come together to help that happen. And then the second question I want us to focus on is, how did the Great Depression then affect the lives of Americans? How did it change them? How did it change them in terms of what they believed in, what they wanted out of life, how they acted, and also change them as far as their actions? What are they doing with their time? What are they doing with their lives? What are their goals? And also changes in demographics. Are people moving? Where are they moving? Why are they moving? Who's moving? These kinds of questions. So those are two of the big ones. We'll have another big one at the end of the unit that we'll talk about. But these are the things that we should be trying to answer as we go through the information. So let's start talking about the first one here, okay? Well, let's talk about the why, or how this happened, okay? Now, this is going to vary as to when the Great Depression started, depending on who you talk to, which historian, okay? But many people kind of look at one event as the start of the Great Depression, and that is Black Tuesday. That happens in October of 1929. Black Tuesday is the day the stock market crashes, okay? Now, as you know from the 1920s, many people had been investing heavily into the stock market, and sometimes even borrowing money to buy stocks because they thought that was the way to get rich. If we do this, we'll eventually sell it off, make a huge profit, pay off our debts, and we'll still have lots of money left over to be on easy street. So when Black Tuesday happens, lots of people are losing their savings, losing their investments, losing their plans of the future, and it kind of triggers a chain reaction and so forth. And then other things kind of fall into place. So what causes the Black Tuesday? How do we get to that point? What brought us here? Well, there are lots of things, and certainly probably more things than I have time to talk to you about here. But these are some general things that are pretty much agreed on. One of the things that we mentioned about the 1920s, again, is that growing gap between the rich and the poor. And that is a big cause of the problem. Again, roughly 90% of the wealth was held by just about 10% of the people. So most of the money was in the hands of just a few individuals. And when those individuals started holding off some of that money, it didn't trickle down to everybody else. Remember the example I've used in class before. We have $100. We're going to take everyone to eat, okay? And 10% of you get $90 to eat, and the other 90% of us only get the $10. And if you guys don't share, if the people with the large amount of money don't share with us, we're going to have a hard time stretching that $10 to feed all of us. And that's kind of what we're talking about here for causes of the Great Depression. Okay, that gap between rich and poor had just gotten so huge that there was just so many people in poverty, teetering on poverty, or if they lost a little bit of money, would certainly be plunged into poverty, and that's a big problem. Anytime you have that in a society, that's kind of a warning sign. One of the other causes of the Depression is the poor banking system that was in play at the time. What was happening is people were borrowing money. As you know, during the 1920s, we have consumerism kicking in. People got to buy. People are trying to get rich quick. People are trying to invest in the stock market. People are buying things beyond their means. Okay? They're doing that with loans. And in the 1920s, the banking system was just basically giving out loans like a Pez dispenser. Anyone who wanted a loan could pretty much get one. And they didn't often check collateral, and they didn't have enough regulations in place to say, well, you know, this is kind of a risky idea. We probably shouldn't lend money to this guy, or this person's overextending. Maybe this isn't the right time to make this purchase. Basically, anybody wanted to borrow money. The economy was going so well, and everybody just thought it was just going to keep going up and up and up. So they were just kind of giving out loans to everybody. Another thing about the banking system is there was nothing in place to regulate what the bankers did with your money. So I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with how the banking system works. You give me money, okay, and as a reward I give you some interest for that money, but I take your money and I'm going to do things with it to make money for myself. I'm either going to loan it to people so they can buy a car or a home, or send their kids to college, or whatever the case may be. Okay, so that's how the banking system works. In the 1920s, there wasn't very many regulations telling me what I could do with your money. So sometimes I would take your money and I would invest it in the stock market for myself. I would take your money and I would spend it on myself. I would take your money and, you know, go on trips or whatever. And so the poor banking system was really at fault here, because what ends up ultimately happening is they lend out all this money, and then people lose their job, or people lose money in the stock market, and for whatever reason they can't pay these loans back. The banks have to close. They have no more money. They have no money coming in. They can't do any business. And so the banks are closing. And if I had a savings account in there, let's say I was an American who saved for a rainy day and I had a savings account, the bank closes, guess what happens to my money? It's gone. It's gone forever. I just lost out. So even if I was one of the ones that was saving and not buying, I was still impacted by this, because these guys gave away my money on all these risky loans. And when I went to go get it, the banks were out of business and gone, and my savings were gone. I was out of my nest egg, or my safety net. And so the poor banking system is really at fault, because it was really helping people spend beyond their means, overextending their credit, and there weren't enough regulations in place to really keep it safe and viable for everyone. Now, I mentioned before about getting rich quick. The big term at the time was speculation. You're going to buy something and you're going to speculate that it's going to go up in value, and then you can sell it and make a profit. Well, as you know, this was a big theme of the 1920s. People were speculating on everything, primarily stocks. People were trying to get rich through the stock market. The idea was basically everyone could or should be rich. You just invest a little bit of money out of your paycheck, and the stocks go up and up and up, and 20 years from now you sell it all off and you're a millionaire. Well, it didn't quite work that way. And sometimes people weren't just putting in a little bit of money, and they get greedy. They want to get rich faster, so they speculate more. And it's not just in stocks, it's with land, or it's with businesses. They're just taking risky investments. So part of the cause of the Great Depression is people just are kind of unwise with their money. They're buying things on credit, as we know, but they're also trying to get rich quick, and living in that moment and overextending themselves with really risky investments instead of saving some money and being more wise with it. And that all helps the money go more into those wealthy people again, and away from the common people. It helps that gap get bigger. Here's a big one. We know that with the turn of the century, America becomes a great manufacturing country. We become, as Coolidge said, the business of America is business. We become a country that is centered around business. We're producing things all the time. Well, what ends up happening is we had innovations like the assembly line and electrifying our factories, and we use scientific management to get so efficient that we start to produce and produce and produce, and pretty soon we're running out of customers. And so what ends up happening is, let's say I'm Henry Ford, for example, and I have 10,000 automobiles in my warehouse I can't sell already. Why should I continue to produce more automobiles when I can't sell the ones I already have? Okay, so supply is outpacing demand. We're having so many goods that we don't need to produce anymore. There's not enough people buying stuff. So what ends up happening then is a vicious cycle. Ford has to lay off some workers or close some plants, and that puts people out of work. Well, now those people don't have a paycheck, or they have less money, so they're spending less. So they're not going to the movies, they're not going on trips, they're not eating out, they're not doing this or that. So now that hurts that small part of your business of economy, that small business sector of your economy. So then those small businesses either go out of business and people are out of work, or they have to cut back on hours or wages, and so again you have less people spending money, and that leads to even more layoffs, and the vicious cycle just keeps repeating because we're producing so much and there's nobody buying, and that leads to another cycle of we got to cut back, and then that leads to fewer people buying and less money circulating, so then we have to cut back, and it just keeps repeating and repeating until you either get a level where people are starting to buy enough, or you hit bottom, or something stops that cycle. And in the Great Depression, that vicious cycle just kept going and going and going. So we'd lay people off, which would lead to more businesses closing, which would lead to more people losing jobs, and so on and so forth. So supply outpacing demand is a big one. Now those are 4 causes of the Great Depression. When you do your seminar, you'll probably come across many other ones. It'll be interesting to see kind of what you say. There are many factors that lead to it. And we'll get into a few more as we go through, and certainly when we do our seminar, we'll come across some more as well. Okay? So now that is going to end part 1 of Unit 12.